Well, we are grateful to have you at Fellowship Memphis this morning. If this is your first visit, I'm John Bryson, one of the pastors here, and want to welcome you. We've got a lunch for you, and so you didn't know that, but we would love to invite you to lunch. If you've been visiting today or the last couple months, we want to get to know your name. We want to take 20 or 30 minutes and just get to know you, and so I want to invite you to that straight out the back, down the right hall, and we'll have lunch waiting. It'll be 20 or 30 minutes, and we would love to meet you. As those designated to take the offering are doing so, I do want to draw our attention to our finances. This is the end of our fiscal year, September 30th, and we really need you to help finish strong. We had a great, consistent, rocking year all the way till about May, the end of May, and then we had a really low June of giving. A lot of that's understandable with summer. We made up for that in July, so we were super excited. Still didn't have a need to really bring it before you. And then we had a really low August, and we're having also a low September. And so we need to hit our September number and cover about $70,000 in order to finish the year in the black and give us room to move into the next year. And so we need you financially. And so if you're a regular giver, thank you for making all this happen. If you consider us home and aren't giving, we would definitely need you to begin doing that. If you're behind in your giving, this would be a phenomenal time to catch up. And so just wanted to bring that before you. Pray through the next couple of weeks with us that we can finish strong, start strong, and just always want to bring your attention to that when it's a real deal. You also got a worship bulletin. You'll see it's the last small groups are launching, and so we'd love for you to get involved in a fellowship group, growth group, DNA group. You can do that online and find those as they're beginning, and so we'll hope to draw your attention to that as well as well as our student ministry. And so those 6th through 12th grade small groups, D groups, are starting, so you can look into that if you're a student or a parent of a student. Well, we began the book of Exodus last year, and so if you're new to your Bible, just go to the very first book. There'll probably be a table of contents, and then Genesis, and then Exodus, and we're going to be looking the next few weeks at the life of Moses and the deliverance of the children of Israel. Now, we have to know why the children of Israel are in Egypt to begin with, because when we open the book of Exodus, that's where they are. So we got to go back for a second and remember that in Genesis 1 and 2, God created all things. That's the perfection of the garden. There was beauty and order. There was perfect unity between God and man, and between man and wife. Imagine that if you're married. And between Adam and Eve and the garden and the animals. And then Genesis 3 come and sin breaks everything. Everything is affected. Everybody is infected with sin. And so we have tornadoes, and we have hurricanes, and we have sin and Satan and his demons and their causes and effects. We have Tennessee fans. Like all of that is the result of the fall. Just picking on you, Tennessee fans. How about those Tigers, by the way? Go Tigers, go, yeah. We'll celebrate that as an act of redemption. That's right. And then you get Cain and Abel, you get Noah, you get a flood, then Genesis 12. We have to know Genesis 12 to understand Exodus 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Genesis 12, God says, I'm going to raise up Abram, call you out of Ur, and out of you I'm going to make you a great nation. And in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, 3 promises that you're going to father a great nation, that the other nations will be blessed by you. So a Messiah is coming that will come in the lineage of Abraham, and I'm going to give you a land. And so God began to build a nation of Israel. And so Genesis 1 through 11 are the planks of creation. Genesis 12 through 50 are the patriarchs, 4 major biographies, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. We get to the last one, Genesis 38 through 50, the story of Joseph. Joseph was born in an unbelievably dysfunctional family. Many of us had dysfunctional families. Joseph is capital D, dysfunctional family. He had a dad and 2 moms who were at war for the affection of dad, so they recruited midwives. And so Joseph grew up in a home with 4 women creating children to try to please the father. And so you can imagine the bitterness between the siblings laboring for the father's affection. Well, Joseph was the favorite son and got this multicolored coat. And so his other brothers took him out in the field one day, and they said, let's kill him. And another brother said, let's not kill him, but let's sell him into slavery. Here came some Egyptian slaves. This is how we're getting the nation of Israel to Egypt. So Joseph gets sold into slavery. His story is a great one. Study it someday. He gets sold into slavery, falsely accused of rape by Potiphar's wife, thrown into prison, forgotten in prison, and then one day he interprets Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh is the king of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world. He's the most powerful man in the most powerful nation of the world. He has a dream about 7 fat cows, and then 7 skinny cows eating the fat cows. Joseph, God allows him to interpret that as Egypt is going to have 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. And so sure enough, they followed through with that warning, stored up all kinds of food. Famine came, and all of the world came to Egypt because they had stored food. Joseph saved the world from famine. God, through Joseph, along with Joseph's family, 70 of them moved to Egypt. Well, 400 years, which is exactly what God predicted in Genesis 15, 400 years, those Israelites moved from 70 to about 2 million. And the Egyptians, Exodus chapter 1, began to fear that they would overcome Egypt. There also arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And that was bad for the Egyptians. So they were enslaved. They were given very hard labor. We learned in Genesis 1 and 2 that Moses was born into that. That Moses was going to be a deliverer, that in Exodus 1 and 2, God raised up Moses right in a day where Pharaoh said, kill all the Israelite boys, all the little babies. And so Moses' mom took him to the Nile, which is significant, put him in a basket, floated him into Pharaoh's castle. Pharaoh's daughter had pity on him, hired Abram's mother to come nurse him, raised him. And so for 40 years, he was raised in the palace of Pharaoh. And yet, as you can see here, Stephen preaches on this before he's stoned in Acts chapter 7. And I want to read you his recap, his insight into Exodus 1 and 2 in a sermon that he preached in Acts chapter 7. Look at it with me on the screen. And it was at this time that Moses was born, and he was lovely in the sight of God. And he was nurtured 3 months in his father's home. And after he had been exposed, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and nurtured him as her own son. And Moses was educated in all the learnings of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in word and deed. So this is young Moses. And when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit the Israelites. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him. And he took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance, but they didn't. And on the following day, he appeared to them, and they were fighting together. And he said to them, men, why, brethren, do you injure one another? But the one who was injuring his neighbor pushed him away, saying, who made you ruler and judge over us? You're not going to kill me like you did the Egyptian yesterday, are you? And at this remark, Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian. He became the father of 2 sons, and for 40 years he was in that wilderness. And then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in the flame of a burning flame. And so we know that Moses' life is divided into 3 segments of 40. In fact, there's multiple themes I just want to remind you about before we get into this, our text this morning, that I want you and I looking for throughout the book of Exodus. You're going to see this biography of Moses. So this isn't just a story of the nation of Israel. You get to see what God's doing in Moses' life. And there's 3 distinct 40s. His first 40, as in Pharaoh's castle, his next 40 in the wilderness, and then boom, where our text will start today, on his 80th birthday, God showed up in a burning bush with a vision for his future. You're going to see themes of redemption. In fact, we're calling this the Gospel of Exodus. We're going to war with the conventional wisdom that the Old Testament is God's wrath and the New Testament is God's grace. I don't want you to see the gospel throughout the whole Bible. I want you to see from Genesis 3, when God says a Redeemer's coming to deal with this sin, that everything in your Old Testament ultimately points to the Redeemer, to the Messiah, Jesus. And so all 39 books of your Old Testament are ultimately one book, pointing to one man, one Redeemer. And every time we read the Old Testament, you get this distant drumbeat. This silhouette begins to emerge. One way to think about your Bible is all your Old Testament is this arrow pointing to this Redeemer coming. And then Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 biography. He's here. And it's unbelievable the life he lived and the lessons he taught and the death he died and the resurrection that he provided salvation for us. And then all the rest of your New Testament is looking back at the implications then of the fact that Messiah has come. The Redeemer is here. And so you see these stories of redemption. If you look at movements anywhere throughout history where oppressed people need to be emancipated, like you'll see drippings of Exodus all over it. In more recent history, you can go back to the 19th century and the abolishment of slavery in Britain, and you'll see William Wilberforce and all of them use all kinds of Exodus language and imagery and verses. You can go in the 20th century and Dr. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. All backdrops of many of those sermons and writings is Exodus. this idea of redemption. We'll see the development of Joshua throughout Exodus as a great leadership development lesson as he helps and serves Moses, and in some beautiful pictures lifts up his arms as the battle's going on in the valley. We realize that the battle's actually going on the mountaintop in prayer as Joshua labors with Moses, preparing for his day to lead one day. And you can read about that in the book of Joshua. We see God's power over all of creation. This thing opens with God taking a little bitty baby on a really, really massive Nile, one of the seven wonders of the world, and taking that baby exactly where he wants to take it on that Nile. You're going to see God today burn a bush without destroying it. You're going to see next week bunches of plagues and frogs and all kinds of crazy things God does to dismantle the gods of the Israelites. You're going to see him push back a Red Sea and then pull it right back together when he wants to. You're going to see a bitter pool of water and a branch thrown in it, and it becomes sweet. You're going to see manna drop from the sky. You're going to see quail come down. And so I hope in this story you'll see your story. See, you and I, if you're in Christ, have been delivered out of Egypt, and we're looking toward a day that's not yet this day. It's not here yet, a promised day in which we're going to be with Jesus, and there'll be no more tears, no more pain, no more loss, no more sin, but this day isn't that day. So you and I are living in a wilderness, learning to dwell with God as he leads us and he provides for us. I want you to find your story in this story, here in the book of Exodus. You'll also see how frail humanity is, right? You see a grumbling and how short our memories are when it comes to God's great work in our life. We're going to see next week, God part a Red Sea, and they go through it, and it brings the sea back together, and he kills the Egyptians, and all of a sudden, where there wasn't a way, there is a way, and they party, like Old Testament party, week-long praise and worship to God. We're going to sing the Song of Moses today during communion, like there's a party. And then 2 days later, they're grumbling and complaining, asking Moses why they don't have food and water, and that there's a conspiracy that Moses brought them out here to kill them. You'll see the frailty of humanity, how quickly we forget what God does for us in an amazing way. And I hope you see a God, the Father, who loves to dwell with us. He doesn't just deliver us to deal with sin and to deal with those things. He wants to dwell with us. He wants to be our good Father. He wants to protect us and provide for us and to care for us, that he saves us for religion. Well, we're in Exodus 3 today, and there's a gap between Exodus 2 and Exodus 3 of 40 years, which is actually the first place we're going to look to learn and apply this. Moses spent his first 40 years thinking he was somebody. He had the best of educations. He was raised in the king's palace. He knew he was to be a deliverer. His name meant deliverer, out from the water. He had been this little miracle baby that Pharaoh had raised, gotten the best education you could possibly get. And he goes and he takes life into his own hands, and he goes and he murders an Egyptian for messing with an Israelite. Just like that, becomes a murderer. Just like the sins of our youth, where I can identify with that, where we're not patient and wait on God. There's no prayer you see in Moses' life. Like he's a self-made, driven, I'm going to go do this on my own agenda. I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to go make things happen. And he goes and moves out ahead of God. Thinking he was a somebody, he acted. In his own arrogance, he acted. And that wasn't God's plan for his life. So God had to give him a second 40 years out in a wilderness. And so he goes out learning he was a nobody when he was thinking he was a somebody. And so he goes out, and all that we know is he meets this guy named Jethro, who becomes his father-in-law. And he spends the next 40 years not in a palace, not in some elite school, not leading some major army or some major initiative. He's out in this terrible wilderness of Midian, which is the worst of the worst when it comes to just how barren it is. And so God takes this deliverer and he takes him out and he puts him in obscurity and mundaneness. And you need to know, and I need to know and be reminded that that's often God's graduate school for greatness. That what God needs to do is break Moses of all of his pride and arrogance and impatience and self-sustaining ideas, and to wean him from everything he thinks he had to have to be that deliverer God was going to make in him. See, God calls us. It's the meta-narrative of our life, and it's the micro-narratives of our life that he calls us into new adventures, new seasons of life. Many of you went from single to married, and married to parent, and parent to empty nester, like new cities, new jobs, new opportunities, new responsibilities. And he often uses those to break us, to bring our idols to the surface, to expose our insufficiencies, to wean us from everything we thought we had to have to be significant and successful in life. But he doesn't just wean us, he does that so that he can redeem us, that we now walk with a limp, we now are, we now have learned those lessons, like coming through those seasons where we're now humbled and we experience God in the wilderness like we can't anywhere else, so that God can use us. So God calls, God breaks, God redeems, God uses. Now, if we were writing our narratives, we would go, God calls, God uses, God calls, God uses. How fun would that be? God called me to this and used me here. But God is sanctifying us. We wouldn't write in breaking. See, wildernesses can be hard. Some of you feel like you're in a wilderness right now. Some of you feel like your marriage is in a wilderness. Some in your parenting, you're in a wilderness. In your job, you're in your wilderness. Moses was literally in the wilderness. The wilderness is the lab of life. There's things we can learn out of devotional books and reading good books, and mountaintops experiences can teach us some things, but classrooms can teach us some things, but they're not life. Like, we need to learn a real life God in a real life situation, providing for us, being like, it's so symbolic in the book of Exodus, a fire by night and a cloud by day. He's leading us. He's feeding us manna. You'll learn about manna. He drops these Krispy Kremes from the sky, like this unbelievable provision, but there's an amazing dailiness to it. You couldn't get tomorrow's manna, just one day. God will give you and I what we need today. Some have described anxiety as worrying about tomorrow's problem without tomorrow's manna. We'll get to that in a couple of weeks. But God is leading them. I'll never forget, I was telling the story to some of our new residents this week, a wilderness year of my life. I thought by the end of my junior year of college, I had everything up and to the right. I was in my plan, I was a 40-year-old Moses. Like, I had my life figured out. I had guided my life and was going to guide my future. Was finishing up at Asbury College, was going to go to the University of Kentucky Law School, and was going to stay an extra year and get an MBA, though I had no idea what a lawyer did, or it just sounded successful, right? And I was heading to my senior year. All of a sudden, this girl breaks up with me, which is a part of every man's testimony. The year did not turn out like I thought it would. I was getting ready I wanted to have a great senior year of baseball. We went 0-38. Let that sit in. We lost 38 straight baseball games, all right? Now, we were already awful. We got scheduled for every homecoming. Every time we had an away game, that school was celebrating something, like Parents' Weekend or homecoming. We were that team. But 0-38, man, that will crush anyone to their knees to holler out for God. And in that time, I met a guy named Tommy Nelson, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. And he just said, man, move to Denton, Texas, and I'll teach you Bible, and then you can make all your big decisions. And I thought, man, I need an older godly man. I need to learn my Bible. I need to figure out life, because I thought I had a plan, and none of it is coming to fruition. I remember I'd never been west of Memphis and had family that lived here, but never been west of here. And I remember just driving across Arkansas, bawling like a baby. I felt like driving across Arkansas will make you cry anyway. But I didn't have this language, but God, like every mile marker, was blowing up idols of, like, I liked being in a place where I was kind of known, and I liked being president of FCA, and I liked having friends, and I liked being able to tell people I was going to law school, and I liked being able to tell people I was a college baseball player, and like all of that was stripped away. And I remember I showed up in Denton, Texas. It was 140 degrees, and I met Tommy, and he was like, what are you doing? Like, you came. I was like, here I am. I didn't bring anything. I thought he would have this apartment furnished for me, or I'd live with some family. He was like, man, you travel light. I was like, what are you talking about, man? You just told me to show up. And he's like, great. And first 2 hours I spent in Denton, Texas, he took his son out to shag balls. I was in khakis and a long sleeve shirt. It was 112. I'm out there just flying balls. I was catching fly balls for his 14-year-old son. He didn't even turn around and talk to me. And I was like, Lord, what have I done? Like, this is the worst mistake of my life. And then had to go get a job. And I remember I was chopping up at this little restaurant. I'd chop up vegetables. And man, I was learning to do my work as unto the Lord. So I'd learn stuff in the morning, and I was working, and so much so the other guys pulled me out back, and they're like, would you slow down? Like, man, you're going to expose us. Like, don't work that fast. And I was like, I can't not work this fast. I was working, learning to be faithful in little things. And then I'd get my job done quick enough, and then I started driving a school bus because I could go do that and then come back and then finish up lunch and then go do that and come back and go help out at the church. And over that year, I remember thinking, like, what am I doing? And I told the residents the other day, if social media would have existed, I would have short-circuited my development, God's development of me. Had I been looking and comparing my life to chopping up stuff and everybody else is going to grad school and starting cool jobs and buying a car and all, like, I would have short-circuited the gift of mundaneness and discomfort and the gift of learning to exist and be faithful in the midst of obscurity. You see, there's some professors in the wilderness, Dr. Obscurity, Dr. Solitude, Dr. Discomfort, Dr. Time, that are tools God uses to sanctify us, to ready us, to prepare us. See, for 40 years, God's in this wilderness before a burning bush ever shows up. Now, did God waste those 40 years? I think we're going to see a humbled and ready and obedient Moses. A perfect Moses? No. No, man. He's going to wrestle with the idea that God's got something else for him. But you're going to see that God has prepared him. And guess what? That wilderness that seemed, that mundaneness, that discomfort that seemed so purposeless, it's going to be that exact wilderness that Moses is going to lead 2 million people through. He needed to know every nook and cranny of that wilderness to lead millions of people. God redeemed this experience in him. So in Genesis 3, know that that's where we're meeting Moses. And let's learn that, especially for you young folks. Like learning to be patient in your development. Like you're not entitled to an awesome job and an awesome everything at 23. Like you need to spend a season of your life making somebody else look great. Seasons of your life serving. Seasons of your life. The best leaders I know were leading long before anybody gave them a title, a paycheck, a microphone, or a corner office. They had learned to take initiative and add value and bring betterness to every piece and facet of their life before anybody paid them to do that. So that decade of your 20s, like you can learn to serve. And our culture's done you an incredible disservice. Something shifted right after I got out of my teens or something, where all of a sudden we wanted to make sure everybody knew they were awesome and everybody got a participation trophy and everybody was awesome at everything, and it was mean to tell you weren't good at something. And I'm sorry for that. And that everything needs to be unbelievably comfortable for you, and you should never surround yourself with anyone who disagrees with you. Because that's not life, that's not truth. We've been lied to. Like life is hard, and God purposely takes you through tons of very difficult situations and very hard jobs that you might learn to grow and flourish and be faithful in the midst of it. It'd be like if you and I were walking through the woods and we saw a cocoon, and we knew from biology class what was happening, like this caterpillar was becoming a butterfly. Like that's amazing, metamorphosis, that's amazing. And if we happened to be there at the moment where that new butterfly was cracking out of the cocoon, like it's so sweet and beautiful, you might think you would want to help it by going, let's open up this cocoon so that butterfly could fly. Well, what would happen is that butterfly falls straight to the ground. Because it's in that struggle of busting out of the cocoon, it gives it the muscles in its wings to be able to fly. And when we try to short circuit that cocoon, when we try to take a shortcut, or we overparent, or we try to overprotect our kids, or we try to make everything nice and easy for everyone, there is then no strength to fly when God calls you into a new assignment. So I think Moses at the end of his life would not wish his wilderness experience on anyone and wouldn't trade it with anybody for anything. That's the wilderness. And then that gets interrupted in chapter 3. Now Moses, you can hear the ordinariness in this, was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Led his flock to the west, came out of the wilderness, came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Angel of the Lord appeared to him. Now that's not just an angel from the Lord. Whenever you see that unique phrase, the angel of the Lord, most scholars agree this is the pre-incarnate Christ. This is how Christ interacted with Old Testament saints. He was called the angel of the Lord. Appeared to him in a blazing fire in the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the brush was not consumed. And so God chooses to interrupt Moses' ordinary. And in fact, that's pretty consistent throughout the Bible. It's kind of the opposite of us. If you're like me, I tend to not be as faithful as I can possibly be in the present because I'm spending so much emotional energy worried about the future, trying to control the future, that I ignore the present, live in the future, try to control the future, get anxious about the future. Biblical heroes are just the opposite. They find a way to be faithful where they are and trust God with their future, and in the midst of their faithfulness, God interrupts them with a new assignment. And so here he comes, the pre-incarnate Christ. He comes as a flame, as fire. That makes a whole lot of sense to me and to our family. Like fires are those beautiful things. We have fires lots of nights and days of the year. We got a fire pit outside. We got a fireplace. We built a fire this morning. And a fire, symbolically, is this thing that is beautiful and warm and can burn you down and kill you, right? And so when I'm educating my kids about our fireplace, it's like when we gather around this, like there's warmth, we're drawn in, it's beautiful. If it gets out of that or you get into it, there's going to be death and destruction. So fire kind of holds both. It's inviting, but there's a holiness to it. There's a respect to it. And so that's how God chooses here to manifest himself to Moses. But he doesn't know that yet. He's just seeing this bush burn. So Moses says, I got to turn aside now and see this marvelous sight. Why is this bush not burned up? The Lord said that he turned aside to look, and God called to him from the midst of the bush, and he said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Now, in that here I am, I hear a lot of growth. I hear a lot of availability. I hear a 80-year-old Moses, not a 40-year-old Moses. That God's got him ready now. And we also see a God who knows Moses' name. So all the way through Exodus, we're holding the tension of God's immanence and his transcendence. Like he is transcendent. He is powerful. He's an almighty being. Every molecule of the universe submits to him. He is the almighty God. And he knows your name. And he shows up personally, individually, and says, Moses, Moses, Adrian, Kim, Ricky, Jack. He knows you. All powerful, all personal. And he comes to him, and now all of a sudden Moses hears this voice. He sees this fire, and he moves toward it. And God says to him, but he still doesn't know who it is. He says, do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place you're standing on is holy ground. And then God says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And then Moses goes, rut-row. Like, this is God. This is the guy I let down 40 years ago. This is the guy, he's got to be done with me. Imagine the fear. Imagine the shame. Imagine the guilt. Moses was supposed to be a deliverer, jumped the gun early, killed a man, and he's thinking this wilderness is all it is for the rest of my life. I'm punished, and I deserve. Imagine the shame. We spoke about just the shame being washed away, or sung about shame being washed away. Like that's when transformation happens, incidentally. When God's amazing grace finally gets to have a head-on collision with our debilitating shame. And when grace meets shame, there's change. There's transformation. And here, Moses has all that in his head, like God's come to deliver more punishment. And the Lord said to him, I've surely seen the afflictions of my people in Egypt, and because of their cry and the taskmasters, I'm going to come down in power to deliver them. And he tells him what he's going to do. And then in verse 10, come now, I'll send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the sons, out of Israel. And Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And so God says, now you're going to go deliver. Like I've used these 80 years to prepare you. You're going to go in a showdown head-to-head with Pharaoh. And incidentally, God is unearthing. This is a worship issue. Like back in Exodus 1, like the two things the Egyptians worshiped the most were Pharaoh, and they were the Nile. And so the fact that God used a little bitty baby to turn down the Nile and to turn down Pharaoh, and when we get into the plagues, you're going to see there's an idol behind every one of those plagues that God is dismantling the worship of the anti-God so that he can establish the worship of the one God, Jehovah. But you can imagine Moses is fearing going back there, right? The Egyptians hate him because he killed an Egyptian, and the Israelites don't trust him and don't know him, don't see him as one of them. He's in a no man's land. He's been in a wilderness. There's racial issues here. There are cultural issues here. I'm not quite an Egyptian. I'm not quite an Israelite. I'm an Israelite by race, but I was raised culturally as an Egyptian, and I'm an Egyptian by culture, but not by race. And now I'm called to go back and get one of them to follow me and the other one to let them? Yeah, I think there would be some insecurity in this, as there is in us. Every time God calls us into any assignment, into any new season of life, there's rampant And insecurity always has as its core identity. Like, who am I and who is God? And if I build my identity on anything other than a child of God, if I can have taken away anything I built my identity on, then that's called idolatry. And we've talked about that a lot around here. So God's doing some of this soul level work. Who am I? And then he looks up and look what he says later. And Moses says, behold, if I do go, the God of the fathers, verse 13, has sent me to you. Now they may say, what is your name? Like, so who are you? Who am I? Who are you? And God says in a famous response, I am who I am. I am who I am. Actually, in the Hebrew, it's I be who I be. That's fun saying it that way. I'm going to be who I will be. I'll be who I've always been, and I'll be who I'll need to be and want to be, and I'll be that way in the future. God's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's not situational. He doesn't say, I'm the deliverer of Israel, though he is, because he's the all-time deliverer of all of us. He is, I am who I am. That ought to be the most comforting thought in the world to the God that you're reconciled with through the work of Jesus, that is leading you and providing for you and is there for you in the most insecure times and the greatest callings of our life. And I want to highlight this as well. Moses says, who am I? And here's what God said in response. He doesn't say, you're awesome. He doesn't say, you can do anything you want to do in all your life. He doesn't say, major in whatever you want to major in. He doesn't say, you've got incredible strengths and you have 40 years of awesome education in Egypt. He doesn't appeal to anything about Moses. Moses says, who am I? And he says, I'll be with you. That's the promise, that I will be with you. And that's the comfort. I am who I am will be with you. God is with you. God doesn't promise us an easy life. In fact, he promises just the opposite. Consider it pure joy, James 1, consider it pure joys, my brother, when you encounter various trials, not if. Suffering, wildernesses, trials, scary new assignments are part of the core curriculum of walking with God. They're not electives. But God does things in them that shows us who he is. God's most personal. He's most near. Going through a wilderness, getting on the other end of a trial, getting on the other end of a season of testing, a season of pain, a season of abandonment, a season of loss, a scary season, you will have experienced the personalness of God in ways you just can't. When we get numbed by comfort and numbed by ease. There's celebration in some of that, but it's in the pain that we understand God on a personal level. And God says that I'm going to be with you. Moses continues to wrestle. You can read about that toward the end of chapter 4. He's wrestling with identity. He's wrestling with how God's going to do this. He's wrestling if Pharaoh will respect him. He starts wrestling with all of those things. And God graciously, because he delivered Moses to dwell with him, enters into the relationship with him. And he enters into that conversation with him. And we're going to see next week he sends him and he's going to be with him in a major way. And you're going to see some of the most remarkable acts of God to free his people from the Egyptians so that he may dwell with them. Exodus starts in agony, but it ends in worship. That he is establishing a way to tabernacle, to dwell with you and I. And as we turn our thoughts toward the table, we need to know that there's actually what we celebrate at the table, the finished work of Jesus Christ, his body sacrificed for us, his blood shed on our behalf. See, there's a truer and greater Abraham, and his name was Jesus. And he did a truer and greater deliverance called salvation by dying on a cross and raising from the dead to defeat Satan, sin, and death. Jesus lived a life you and I couldn't have lived, died a death we deserved, rose again to defeat Satan, sin, and death, that through him we may be reconciled with God. And so Jesus is the truer and greater Moses. Jesus is the truer and greater deliverance. Jesus is the truer and greater dwelling. So because of the finished work of Jesus, if you're in him, you don't have to go to a tabernacle and have a priest represent you. It's a truer and greater dwelling. His Spirit lives within you. When he says he's with you always because he's within you. And that's the incredible gift of what the Spirit is. And so let's celebrate Jesus, the truer deliverer, as we remember him through communion. Father, thank you for these tables. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you that we can do this in remembrance of you. And thank you for Moses, Lord, the biography of Moses, the epic thing you're doing of redemption through him and in him. God, I pray for all of us that you'll pierce our hearts through this series, that we may learn of you and that we may learn of ourselves. Lord, for anyone in here that's in a season of wilderness, that might be a friendship season of wilderness, work, marriage, parenting, whatever it is, that God, you would show yourself to them in a powerful way, that they would be reminded that you are with them in the midst of whatever may come, that you'll be with them. Father, we love you and we bless your name. In Christ's name, amen.